There is something quietly fascinating about the open road. The idea that you could pack your entire life into a vehicle, point it toward the horizon, and simply go, that idea has captured the American imagination for well over a century. But while most people picture RVs or travel trailers when they think of mobile living, there exists a stranger, more inventive chapter in the story of roadbound shelter. A chapter built not on comfort and convention, but on ingenuity, desperation, and sometimes a kind of beautiful madness. Today, we are going back through the decades, back to an era when welders, woodworkers, and weekend dreamers transformed ordinary pickup trucks into rolling homes that defied every expectation. Some of these builds were commercial products that quietly disappeared from history. Others were one-of-a-kind creations that survived only in photographs and faded advertisements. All of them are real, and every single one of them will make you look twice. This is the story of 10 of the strangest vintage truck campers you won't believe are real. Number 10. The Alaskan Camper on a Ford F-100. The camper that hid in plain sight. In the early 1960s, the American truck camper industry was still finding its footing. Manufacturers were experimenting wildly with shape, material, and layout, and in that creative chaos, a small Washington state-based builder named Alaskan Camper Company produced what many historians now consider one of the most deceptively brilliant designs ever to leave a truck bed unrecognized. At rest, the Alaskan Camper looked almost embarrassingly modest. Mounted most commonly on a Ford F-100 half-ton pickup, its profile was so low and so understated that at a highway rest stop, most passers-by would not have given it a second glance. The roofline barely cleared the cab. The sidewalls were flat, unadorned aluminum. There were no decorative graphics, no sweeping curves, no visual language that announced leisure or adventure. It looked, frankly, like a contractor's covered utility bed that had been painted on a slow afternoon. And that was precisely the disguise. Because the Alaskan Camper was not a fixed-height unit. It was a hydraulic pop-up truck camper, one of the first of its kind to enter commercial production, and when you cranked the roof upward using a simple hand mechanism, the entire upper section rose on for corner posts, transforming that anonymous lowrider into a full standing height living space with room for a double bed, a galley kitchen, a small dining area, and overhead storage that most competitors could not match. The engineering was straightforward but deeply considered. When collapsed for travel, the unit sat low enough to pass under most bridge clearances without drama. When expanded at camp, it offered a surprisingly spacious interior. The aluminum construction kept weight reasonable for the Ford F-100's platform, which in its top configuration was running a 352 cubic inch Fa Series V8 producing around 220 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. That was more than adequate for the task, and drivers noted that the low travel profile actually improved the handling characteristics of the loaded truck compared to taller, fixed-roof competitors. The Alaskan's limitations were real, if modest. The pop-up mechanism required some practice to operate smoothly. The canvas sidewalls of the expanded section offered less insulation than a rigid wall unit, which in the Pacific Northwest winters the company was born in, was a genuine consideration. And the overall aesthetic, even when fully deployed, was utilitarian rather than inviting. But none of that dimmed the core achievement. The Alaskan Camper had found a way to give you more by appearing to offer less, and in doing so, it quietly pioneered a design philosophy that still echoes through the overland vehicle community today. Some ideas look exactly like what they are only when you know what to look for. Number 9. The Caveman Camper on a Chevrolet C10. The camper that wore a stone face. By the mid-1960s, the American consumer was beginning to expect a certain visual vocabulary from recreational vehicles. Chrome accents, two-tone paint, rounded corners, the language of optimism and modernity that defined mid-century American design. Most manufacturers were eager to speak that language as loudly as possible. The Caveman Camper, produced by a small Oregon outfit in the mid-1960s and mounted almost exclusively on the Chevrolet C10 half-ton platform, chose a completely different dialect. Its exterior was finished in a textured fiberglass material that the manufacturer had deliberately molded to resemble rough-hewn stone. Not subtly, not in a way that might be mistaken for a stylized pattern or an unusual paint technique. The entire outer surface of this camper was covered in a raised, irregular texture designed to evoke the appearance of a primitive stone dwelling. The entry door featured a rounded arch. The small windows were set into recessed surrounds that mimicked the look of openings carved into rock. From the correct angle, in the right light, it genuinely looked as though someone had strapped a small Neolithic structure to the back of a 1965 Chevrolet C10 and driven it to a state park. The design intent, according to period advertising, was to create a camper that felt connected to nature rather than imposed upon it. Whether that philosophy was genuinely held or was simply the best story a creative marketing writer could tell about an unusual aesthetic decision is difficult to say at this distance, but the result was undeniable in its strangeness. Beneath that prehistoric exterior, the Caveman was a reasonably well-appointed unit for its era. It offered a rear double bed, a propane cooktop, a small icebox, and a fold-out dining bench. The interior walls were finished in warm knotty pine paneling, a choice that reinforced the rustic theme while adding a degree of genuine warmth to the space. The Chevrolet C10 carrying it was typically equipped with a 250 cubic inch inline-six producing around 155 horsepower, or optionally the 283 cubic inch V8 developing 195 horsepower. Neither engine was asked to perform heroically, and the Caveman's modest weight kept the platform within comfortable operating range. Its floors were mostly cosmetic in the conventional sense, which is to say, it looked like a building material sample that had escaped from a quarry. Resale was complicated by the fact that buyers either loved the concept or found it genuinely unsettling. There was no middle ground, but for the owner who drove it with confidence, it was a statement unlike anything else at the campground. And in its own peculiar way, it remains one of the most committed aesthetic visions in the history of recreational vehicle design. Number 8. The Go-Tag Camper on a Dodge Power Wagon. The camper built for where roads ended. There is a category of vintage equipment that becomes legendary not because of its beauty or its innovation, but because of its honesty. The Go-Tag Camper, produced in limited numbers in the late 1960s and paired almost exclusively with the Dodge Power Wagon 3/4-ton four-wheel drive platform, belongs firmly in that category. On a casual inspection, the Go-Tag looked like a box. A well-built box, assembled from riveted aluminum sheet over a welded steel frame, with corners sharp enough to cut through wind resistance by sheer stubbornness. There were no curves. There were no aesthetic flourishes. There was a door, two small windows with storm shutters, a ventilation hatch, and a set of external tie-down points that suggested the manufacturer had spent more time thinking about what could go wrong in rough terrain than about what might look good in a brochure photograph. That impression was accurate. The Go-Tag was designed specifically for backcountry use, for their hunters, prospectors, survey crews, and wilderness guides who needed a sleeping and cooking platform that could survive not just rough roads but the genuine absence of roads. Its construction spec was closer to a military utility container than a consumer recreational product. The aluminum skin was heavier gauge than comparable units. The internal framing was over-engineered by any commercial standard. The door seals were designed to keep out not just rain but blowing dust, insects, and the particular kind of cold that inhabits high-altitude terrain after dark. Inside, the Go-Tag offered a sleeping platform for two, a propane heater, a single-burner cooktop, a water tank, and storage for gear rather than comfort items. There was no aesthetic effort made toward the interior. The walls were bare aluminum. The floor was marine-grade plywood. The lighting was a single dome lamp and whatever you brought with you. The Dodge Power Wagon beneath it was running the legendary 251 cubic inch flathead 6 in earlier configurations, or the later 318 cubic inch V8 producing around 200 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque. In four-wheel drive low range with the Go-Tag aboard, this combination was nearly unstoppable across the terrain it was built to traverse. Its limitations were equally honest. It was not comfortable in any conventional sense. It was heavy for a half-cab truck, and its utterly anonymous appearance meant that at a developed campground, it inspired curiosity rather than admiration. But the Go-Tag was never trying to impress anyone at a developed campground. It was trying to get you to places where developed campgrounds did not exist, and in that specific mission, it was remarkable. If you have ever owned or traveled in a purpose-built backcountry camper like this one, share your experience in the comments. These working-class rigs have stories attached to them that deserve to be told. Number 7. The Streamline Camper on a Ford F-250. The aerodynamic camper that defied its own era. Most vintage truck campers are not remembered for their aerodynamics. They are boxy, upright, flat-fronted structures that treat wind resistance as an inconvenience rather than an engineering problem. Which is precisely what makes the Streamline Camper, produced by a Pacific Northwest manufacturer beginning in 1968 and mounted primarily on the Ford F-250 3/4-ton platform, so genuinely unusual. The Streamline's design language owed more to aircraft fuselage construction than to conventional recreational vehicle building. The unit was formed entirely from hand-laid fiberglass, not unusual for the era, but its shape was something the market had not seen before. The front face, which abutted the Ford F-250's cab, was concave rather than flat, curving inward slightly to reduce the turbulent air pocket that formed between cab and camper on most conventional units. The sidewalls tapered gently toward the rear, and the roof carried a subtle but measurable crown that shed crosswind pressure rather than simply absorbing it. The rear corners were radiused in a tight arc that allowed airflow to detach cleanly rather than tumbling into drag. The manufacturer's own testing, conducted with a somewhat informal methodology that was nonetheless more rigorous than anything any competitor had attempted, suggested that the streamline reduced aerodynamic drag by roughly 18% compared to a flat-fronted unit of equivalent interior volume. Drivers confirmed the real-world benefit: improved fuel economy on highway runs, reduced cab noise at speed, and a noticeably more stable feel in crosswind conditions that the flat-fronted alternatives handled with considerably less grace. The Ford F-250 carrying the streamline was typically ordered with the 360 cubic inch face series V8, producing around 215 horsepower and 327 pound-feet of torque. With the streamline's aerodynamic advantage, highway cruising at 65 miles per hour was achievable without the engine working particularly hard, a meaningful difference on a cross-country run. The streamline's floors were real. The fiberglass construction, while beautifully shaped, was more susceptible to stress cracking along the concave front section than flat-panel competitors. The interior volume, sacrificed slightly to achieve the tapered exterior geometry, was noticeably less than boxy alternatives at the same price point, and the design was difficult and expensive to repair after any significant impact. But as a statement of intent, as proof that someone in the truck camper industry was thinking about physics as carefully as they were thinking about storage, the streamline was extraordinary. Some ideas arrive decades before the market is ready to fully appreciate them. Number 6. The Chinook camper on a Toyota Land Cruiser FJ55. The import that nobody expected. By the early 1970s, the truck camper market in America was almost entirely defined by domestic full-size platforms. Ford F-Series, Chevrolet C-Series, Dodge D-Series, these were the accepted foundations of mobile living, and the manufacturers who built bodies for them had calibrated everything to the dimensions, weight ratings, and cultural assumptions of the American half-ton and three-quarter-ton truck. Then Chinook Motorhomes of Yakima, Washington did something that surprised almost everyone in the industry. They built a camper for the Toyota Land Cruiser FJ55 station wagon platform, and in doing so, produced one of the most unexpected and ultimately influential rigs of the decade. The Chinook on the FJ55 was not a traditional slide-in truck camper. It was a coach-built conversion that replaced the Land Cruiser's rear bodywork with a purpose-designed fiberglass living module that integrated with the vehicle's frame and cab in a way that created a genuinely unified visual whole. From the outside, it looked like a compact, purposeful travel vehicle from a manufacturer that had thought carefully about proportion and balance. From the inside, it offered a small but complete living space, a rear bed, a galley kitchen, a dining area that converted to sleeping for two, and storage that used the compact dimensions with impressive efficiency. The Toyota Land Cruiser FJ55 was powered by the F-Series inline six-cylinder engine displacing 3.9 liters and producing approximately 135 horsepower and 210 pound-feet of torque. By American truck standards of the era, these numbers were modest. But the FJ55 was also substantially lighter than any domestic platform, and the Chinook conversion preserved that relative lightness, resulting in a rig that was genuinely more maneuverable, more fuel-efficient, and more capable on narrow Forest Service roads than anything built on a full-size American truck. The 0 to 60 time in this configuration was approximately 17 seconds, not a number to brag about in isolation, but entirely appropriate for a vehicle that was never intended to compete on acceleration and was instead designed to persist across terrain that would strand less thoughtfully constructed alternatives. Its limitations were the limitations of the platform: limited payload, modest towing capacity, and an interior that demanded a certain acceptance of smallness from its occupants. Parts availability, in an era before Toyota's American dealer network had fully matured, was a genuine practical concern. But the Chinook on the FJ55 proved something important. It proved that the truck camper concept was not the exclusive property of American full-size trucks, and in doing so, it opened a door that the overland community has been walking through ever since. Number 5. The Sportsman camper on a Jeep Gladiator J Series. The camper nobody believed could work. There is a particular category of automotive history that belongs to ideas dismissed as impractical by nearly everyone who first encountered them, and later vindicated by everyone who actually tried them. The sportsman camper, produced in the late 1960s and early 1970s by a Colorado manufacturer and mounted on the Jeep Gladiator J-Series pickup, belongs in that category without qualification. The Jeep Gladiator of that era, specifically the J, 2000 and J, 3000 series, was a truck that occupied an unusual position in the market. It was a full-size pickup built on a body-on-frame platform with genuine four-wheel drive capability, powered by either the 232 cubic inch AMC inline-six producing around 145 horsepower, or the optional 327 cubic inch V8 developing approximately 250 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque. It was a capable, durable truck that was nonetheless frequently overlooked in favor of the more glamorous Ford and Chevrolet offerings. The Sportsman camper, designed specifically for the Gladiator's shorter bed dimensions, was a slide-in unit that emphasized off-road capability above all other considerations. Its mounting hardware was over-engineered for articulation. It used a 4-point tie-down system with rubber isolators that allowed the camper to flex independently of the truck frame during extreme off-camber traverses. This was not a common feature in an era when most camper builders assumed their products would spend their working lives on paved roads and level campsites. The unit's interior reflected the same philosophy. Storage was secured behind positive latch doors. The propane system featured a shutoff that could be reached without entering the camper. The fresh water tank was positioned low and central to minimize the effect on the Gladiator's center of gravity during off-road use. From the outside, the Sportsman on the Gladiator looked like any other pickup camper of the period, boxy, functional, modest in its visual ambitions. Nothing about its appearance communicated the engineering thought that had gone into its construction. Its flaws were honest ones. The AMC platform, while capable, was not as widely serviced as Ford or GM trucks, which added complexity to long-distance travel. The shorter bed meant interior length was a compromise. And the 4-point flex mount system, while brilliant in principle, required periodic inspection and adjustment that many owners were not prepared for. But for the driver who understood what the Sportsman on the Jeep Gladiator was actually offering, a genuine off-road camper system a decade before the concept had a name, it was a revelation in every terrain it entered. If you are enjoying this journey through some of history's most overlooked rolling homes, consider subscribing. We cover vehicles like these regularly, the ones history forgot to celebrate properly. Number 4. The Nimrod camper on an International Harvester Scout 800. The camper that fit where nothing else could. The International Harvester Scout 800 was never designed to carry a camper. It was a compact, purpose-built four-wheel drive utility vehicle produced from 1965 onward, intended for farmers, ranchers, and outdoor-minded buyers who needed capability in a smaller package than the full-size IH Travel All offered. Its bed was short. Its payload rating was modest. Its wheelbase was compact enough that stability under load was a genuine engineering consideration. None of that stopped the Nimrod Manufacturing Company of Wakarusa, Indiana from building one anyway. The Nimrod camper for the Scout 800 was, by necessity, one of the smallest hard-sided truck campers ever to enter commercial production. It measured just 62 inches in interior length, barely 5 feet of living space, from the rear wall to the forward cab over section. And yet within that compressed footprint, the designers at Nimrod managed to fit a 2-burner propane cooktop, a small stainless sink with a fresh water tank, a fold-down dining table that converted to a sleeping platform, overhead storage cabinets, and a 12-volt lighting system powered from the Scout's battery. The execution was not merely adequate, it was, within its constraints, genuinely impressive. The fold-down mechanisms were precise. The cabinetry used dovetail joinery that was uncommon in production campers of the era. The exterior fiberglass work was clean and well finished. Nimrod was a manufacturer that took craftsmanship seriously across their entire product range, and it showed even at this miniature scale. The International Harvester Scout 800 beneath it was running either the IH 152 cubic inch 4-cylinder engine producing around 93 horsepower, or the optional 196 cubic inch for producing approximately 111 horsepower. Neither figure suggests performance in any meaningful sense, and with the Nimrod aboard, 0 to 60 was an exercise in patience rather than excitement. Estimates place the figure at well over 20 seconds in most configurations. But the Scout 800 with the Nimrod was never about speed. It was about access. It could navigate roads, and non-roads, that would have stopped a full-size rig at the trailhead. It could park in spaces that would have challenged a standard passenger car. It could slip into campsites that the larger, more comfortable units could not reach. And for the owner who valued those qualities above all others, the fact that it was sleeping inside what was essentially a glorified cargo pod mounted on a compact utility vehicle was not a limitation. It was the entire point. The smallest rigs often reach the most interesting places. Number 3. The Astro Camper on a GMC C20. The camper that looked like it arrived from another decade. In 1970, with the space race still fresh in the American consciousness and the visual language of science fiction reaching into every corner of consumer product design, a Michigan-based manufacturer introduced a truck camper unit called the Astro, and in naming it, they made a promise that the design very nearly kept. Mounted on the GMC C20 3/4-ton platform, the Astro Camper was perhaps the most aggressively futuristic-looking production camper ever to reach the American market. Its exterior was constructed from a proprietary fiberglass formula that the manufacturer described as aerospace-derived, a claim that was likely more marketing than metallurgy, but the material did produce a surface finish of unusual smoothness and depth. The overall shape featured a pronounced forward rake on the front face, a roof that curved upward from front to rear in a continuous arc, and a rear panel that incorporated two circular porthole windows set symmetrically on either side of a central entry door. Those circular windows were the Astro's most recognizable feature. They measured 14 inches in diameter, were framed in brushed aluminum, and gave the rear elevation of the camper an unmistakably nautical, almost spacecraft-like character. From behind, parked in a campground, the Astro looked like something that might have been designed for a mission rather than a vacation. The interior continued the theme with less restraint than one might have hoped. The cabinetry was laminated in a silver-gray material that the catalog called lunar finish, and the overhead panels were lined with a textured vinyl that attempted, with mixed results, to suggest the interior of a control module. The actual living amenities were entirely conventional: a double bed, a 3-burner propane range, an icebox, a dinette, and a wet bath in the larger configurations. The science fiction was entirely skin-deep. The GMC C20 carrying the Astro was typically fitted with the 307 cubic inch V8 producing around 200 horsepower, or the optional 350 cubic inch V8 developing 255 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. Either engine moved the combination with reasonable authority, and the Astro's curved roofline provided a modest but real aerodynamic benefit over flat-topped competitors. Its flaws were the flaws of ambition's slightly overreaching execution. The circular porthole windows, beautiful as they were difficult to seal against rain and impossible to replace with standard hardware. The interior aesthetic aged poorly. By the mid-1970s, the lunar finish looked less futuristic than faded, and the asking price carried a premium that the actual living standards did not always justify. But in 1970, in a campground full of boxy aluminum boxes, the Astro was a genuine spectacle. And there is something to be said for a vehicle that made people stop and stare even when it was standing perfectly still. Number 2. The Hilo Camper on a Ford F-350. The camper with a secret it only revealed at camp. By the mid-1970s, the truck camper market had largely settled into predictable patterns. Fixed-roof units dominated the upper half of the market. Pop-up tent campers held the entry level. And in between, a handful of manufacturers were fighting for the space where practicality and livability intersected. The Hilo Camper Company of Butler, Ohio found that space, and then did something entirely unexpected with it. Their flagship unit, mounted most commonly on the Ford F-350 one-ton platform, appeared at first glance to be the most unremarkable object in any parking lot it occupied. Low profile, flat-sided, finished in a range of subdued colors that seemed chosen specifically for their ability to disappear into backgrounds. At highway speed, behind a Ford F-350 with its 400 cubic inch V8 producing 158 horsepower and 322 pound-feet of torque, it generated so little visual interest that passing drivers rarely looked twice. Then you arrived at camp. Number 1. The truck camper that built a culture. The four-wheel camper on a Toyota Hilux. Every category has an origin it can point to. A moment when the pieces that had been floating separately finally assembled themselves into something coherent and lasting. In the story of the lightweight, off-road capable, go-anywhere truck camper, the category that defines the overland movement of the 21st century, that moment belongs largely to the Four-Wheel Camper Company of Woodland, California, and their early pop-up units mounted on the Toyota Hilux compact pickup. The pairing began in earnest in the mid to late 1970s, as the Toyota Hilux was establishing itself as one of the most durably capable light trucks in the American market. The Hilux's 2.2-liter overhead-cum 4-cylinder engine produced approximately 96 horsepower and 120 pound-feet of torque. By any objective standard, those numbers were modest. By the standards of a vehicle that weighed less than 2,400 pounds and could traverse terrain that destroyed full-size American trucks through sheer mechanical persistence, they were entirely sufficient. Four-wheel camper recognized something in that combination that the mainstream recreational vehicle industry had not yet understood. The future of adventure travel was not going to be driven by comfort escalation, by ever larger units with ever more amenities mounted on ever heavier platforms. It was going to be driven by the opposite impulse, by the desire to go further, into more difficult terrain, with less weight and less complexity. Their camper unit for the Hilux reflected that philosophy at every level. Constructed from a welded aluminum frame with a lightweight fabric sidewall system in the raised position, the four-wheel camper sat so low in travel mode that the loaded Hilux retained handling characteristics that were genuinely close to those of the unladen truck. The center of gravity remained manageable. The approach and departure angles that made the Hilux capable off-road were preserved rather than compromised. In camp, the raised unit offered a comfortable sleeping platform for two, a functional galley kitchen, propane heat, and storage calibrated for the needs of backcountry travelers rather than weekend resort campers. Nothing about the interior was luxurious. Everything about it was considered. The 0 to 60 time of a Hilux carrying this load was somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 19 seconds depending on configuration, a number that, in the context of what this vehicle was designed to do, is almost entirely irrelevant, because the four-wheel camper on the Toyota Hilux was not built for speed. It was built for the Mojave at sunrise, for logging roads in October, for the kind of silence you only find when you have driven further than most people are willing to go. Its limitations were real but accepted. Cold weather camping in the fabric wall configuration required serious sleeping equipment and personal tolerance for the limits of insulation. Interior height, even fully raised, was sufficient rather than generous. And the Toyota's modest payload rating demanded careful attention to the weight of gear carried inside the camper. But here is what separates the four-wheel camper from every other entry on this list. The others were curiosities, remarkable objects that earned their place in history through strangeness, audacity, or engineering cleverness applied to a narrow and specific purpose. The four-wheel camper on the Toyota Hilux was something more than a curiosity. It was an argument, a quiet, persistent, road-tested argument, that the right vehicle for adventure was not necessarily the largest or the most powerful or the most fully equipped. It was the one that could take you where you actually wanted to go and bring you home again when the journey was finished. That argument proved persuasive. It still does. And so we come to the end of our journey through 10 of the strangest, most inventive, and most genuinely surprising truck campers that the 20th century produced. From the stone-faced caveman to the futuristic Astro. From the invisible Alaskan to the double-expanding Hilo. From the purpose-built simplicity of the GoTag to the world-opening accessibility of the four-wheel camper on a Hilux. Each of these vehicles carried with it a set of ideas about what travel could be, about the relationship between mobility and shelter, between ambition and practicality, between the road and the life lived alongside it. What they share, across all their differences, is the quality that makes this history worth revisiting. They were made by people who looked at a pickup truck and saw not just a vehicle, but a possibility. And in that act of imagination, they built something that outlasted every road they traveled. If any of these rigs surprised you, or if you have a personal connection to one of them, an old photograph, a story from a grandparent, a memory from the back of one of these very campers, share it in the comments below. This history belongs to the people who lived it as much as to their vehicles themselves. If you found value in this exploration, a like helps this channel continue finding the stories that deserve to be told. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And until then, drive well, travel far, and pay attention to the vehicles that nobody else is looking at. They are almost always the most interesting ones on the road.